Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I feel extremely glad to welcome everyone to this public lecture. Honorable Chairperson for KCHR, Professor K.N. Ganesh, Honorable Director, Professor Dineshan Vadakinil, respected Speaker, Dr. Deepthi Murali, distinguished scholars, and my dear colleagues. Today, we have a fruitful academic session by Dr. Deepthi Murali on the topic Digital Public History and Modern India. Dr. Deepthi Murali is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Art History, George Mason University. After the completion of the event, Dr. Deepthi is also the co-principal investigator for the HBCU History and Cultural Access Consortium, a digital public history initiative by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Deepthi's research and public history and work has been supported by numerous grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Arts and Humanities Research Council, Mellon Foundation, American Institute of Indian Studies, and Yale Center for British Art. After the completion of the event, I am sure that you all will be filled with particular knowledge on this particular topic. After the session, we will have a question-answer session. The questions can be typed on the chat box, and we will read them out for the convenience of the speaker. If you still have any concerns on typing, you can ask the questions directly to the speaker. For this purpose, you can use raise hand option. We will read your name accordingly. I feel honored to welcome you all once again for this webinar. I request Professor K.N. Ganesh to kindly take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, and I request Dr. Deepthi Murali to present her lecture, and then we'll proceed with the discussion afterwards.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, KCHR, Ganesh sir, and everybody. Somi got them all to involved in putting this together. I'm really glad to present before you some of the work. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can hear.
Okay. I'm also going to share my screen right now. So if you can also confirm that you can see my screen.
We can see it, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So before I start the talk, because this is happening at KCHR, I have to first start with an apology because I am not going to be speaking a lot about Kerala or art history, because that is where I started my research specialization. And so, but this talk is going to have very little bit of Kerala in it because I'm going to talk more about the digital public history portion of my work. But I promise that I will have more digital public history projects in the future to come and talk to you all about. And I can talk more about my work on Kerala in the Q&A if there is interest. So with that, this past week has been kind of a discomforting time for people like me living in the United States for the obvious reasons. And amidst the fear of an anti-democratic government coming into power, historians in the US, UK, and India were united against one man. And it is not the person you're thinking of. It is actually the man, William Dalrymple, the historian. William Dalrymple, at a recent event, remarked that in the 21st century, historians of India were writing for other academics using language and theory that made their work inaccessible to the general public. He said that it is, and this happened like last week, he said that it is these historians who have contributed to the growth of what he called the WhatsApp history or the WhatsApp University. As you can imagine, academics did not take kindly to being assigned the blame for the spread of pseudo-history, and they reacted loudly and hotly on social media. The response to Dalrymple's critique broadly were of two kinds. On the one hand, academics argued that Dalrymple was discounting the concerted agenda of right-wing pro-Hindutva groups in the spread of pseudo-history as the powers that be systematically deconstructed history education in India. They objected by saying that discounting the propagandistic nature of many of the WhatsApp history makers made Dalrymple's remarks biased and lopsided. Others claimed that to make academic history palatable to the public is, quote, absurd stuff. Deep history, they argued, is simply untranslatable to the public. And I have put some of these tweets on the slide so you can read them fully. So who is right in these arguments? Maybe we can get to that later, but for the time being, let's assume that Dalrymple is right. Let's consider that it is the fault of historians that people don't want to engage with history that is fact-based, painstakingly researched, and critically reviewed. If Dalrymple is right, then how can academic historians do better? Dalrymple's critique is not new and is not specific to India either. The call has come from the inside the house many times. In 2015, Thomas Bender, a historian at New York University, wrote in an article titled "How Historians Lost Their Public" that academic historians are a victim of their own success. As the discipline of history grew in Western universities in the 1960s and 70s, new subdisciplines and specializations emerged, history became more analytic, and debates became narrowly focused. This is around the time that academic history also appears as a professionalized field in India, and a whole host of academics trained in Western institutions appear in South Asian historical studies, such as the now controversial Romilat Bhavat. Over the course of the 70s and the 80s, Indian historians make a significant mark in the discipline of history with the studies that they undertook in areas of labor, caste, class, and colonialism. Some of these scholars, like Ranajit Guha, spearheaded one of the most important fields of humanities scholarship, the subaltern school that studied the history of colonial India as history of marginalized and oppressed groups, rather than as history of kings and empires. Their work was heavily influenced by post-colonial theory of Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, and blended deep archival research with literary and cultural analysis. This is the type of interdisciplinary stuff that one of the critiques of Dalrymple referred to as not for the public history. I disagree with this analysis, by the way. All history, I argue, can be and must be for the public. So how do we then bridge the seeming divide between academic history and bringing the work of actual historians to WhatsApp? To me, this answer is simple, if complex to achieve. It is through the discipline of public history, and specifically through digital public history, that we address the issue of the WhatsApping of history in India. This is not a new concept by any means. So in this talk, I will briefly outline what is public history and digital public history and show you some current examples of digital public history. I will also address a question of how is making history accessible to the public different from that of writing academic history? And how do you even become a public historian or a digital historian or a digital public historian? In addressing all these questions, I will also talk about my own experience working as an interdisciplinary scholar at the crossroads of art history, history, and digital public history. And I will show you a little bit of my digital public history project that I've been working on in the past couple of years. In the course of the discussion, I'm also hoping that I can offer you some examples and tools of working on digital public history. And this talk is meant as a starting point, so I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible so that we have more time in the Q&A in case you have more questions about digital, the field or the tools that I will briefly showcase here. The subdiscipline of public history has been around in the US since the 1970s. It was founded on the understanding that we need historians to produce history for a non-academic public while sharing authority with that public. The idea of digital public history, using digital tools and methods to disseminate history and engage public in participatory history, has also now been a part of the practice of public historians since the 1990s. To be sure, it has been a small subset of academics who claim the classification of public historians, even in the US, but they have contributed significantly to the discourse through books, podcasts, op-eds, public education, digital and community projects, and so on. So what exactly is this field? Public history or public humanities, whether in analog or digital form, simply put, places communities or public audiences at the center of their work. Suzanne Fisher defined public history as, quote, cracking open history as a democratic project and doing it transparently in public, end quote. So doing public history involves historians taking part in historical work outside the university to some extent, in collaboration with communities, historical societies, museums, archives, or government offices. And when this work is done through digital media or using digital tools, this becomes digital public history. But just because a book or a research project is on the web, it does not automatically become digital public history. Digital public history is more than that. It's not simply putting historical materials online. It is a field where technology transforms how we research, share, and interpret the past. As a subfield of public history, it seeks to make historical work accessible and engaging to the public with a critical eye on the role that digital technology plays in shaping historical knowledge. For example, digital public historians spend a lot of time thinking about who we are building a website for. Is it for students in a high school? Is it for people whose first language is not English? Depending on our intended audience, the way we write or how we present historical information changes. If you're designing a project to be used in an elementary school classroom, for example, digital public historians might present historical topics in visually engaging forms rather than in text-based narratives. If we are targeting adults who are interested in history and want to engage deeply with history but have little time to do so in a classroom setting, public historians might use the format of narrative storytelling podcasts to communicate history to that audience. Digital public history, therefore, draws from a blend of public history theory, which emphasizes collaboration, shared authority, and community engagement. And in the methodologies, they prioritize open access, experimentation, and using computational tools. Scholars like Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig have articulated a vision where digital public history not only provides resources to a broad audience, but also invites users into the process of creating historical knowledge, which challenges traditional boundaries between historians and the public. So at the heart of digital public history are several guiding theories, one of which is the concept of shared authority, a term coined by historian Michael Frisk. Shared authority challenges the idea that historians hold a monopoly in interpreting the past, and emphasizing the idea that community members, stakeholders, and the public should have a voice in shaping historical narratives. This theory drives projects like History Pin, a crowdsourced archive where users can contribute photos and stories tied to specific locations. By enabling public contributions, History Pin embodies shared authority and provides an alternative to top-down models of historical interpretation. By the way, I will request the organizers to share the link to these slides, and each of these slides, they are actually, if you click on the slides, you can get links to go to these websites directly. Another important theoretical foundation of digital public history is participatory culture, as described by media scholar Henry Jenkins. In a participatory culture, audiences don't just consume content, they also create, share, and remix it. Digital public history adopts this approach by inviting users to interact with historical content and add their voices. This is seen in projects such as the Transcribe Bentham Initiative, where the public is encouraged to transcribe the papers of philosopher and politician Jeremy Bentham. Projects like these not only democratize access to historical materials, but also turn the public into active participants in the creation of historical knowledge. So digital public history uses a diverse toolkit and methods to do this kind of work, from data visualization to text analysis to mapping. Data visualization allows historians to uncover and represent patterns in historical data that might not be apparent through traditional methods. So for example, in this project called Mapping Inequality, this project uses GIS to visualize historic redlining maps, showing how discriminatory practices in the past have shaped American cities. So redlining is a process by which previously in the US, cities were segregated into Black and white communities without actually expressly saying that they were segregated into Black and white communities. And those neighborhoods still exist as segregated neighborhoods, even though the practice is not ongoing. This project uses digital mapping to bring archival data, mainly maps, to life in a way that helps users see the lingering impacts of policies, racist policies like this on neighborhoods today. Oral history projects are another popular method to do digital public history. Digital platforms have made it possible to collect, share, and even map oral histories in ways that capture a more personal side of history. The September 11 Digital Archive by the American Social History Project and the center where I work, Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, for example, collected thousands of personal stories from people affected by the 9/11 September 11 attacks. The digital format enabled broad participation, and today this archive serves as a record of public memory around a transformative historical event for the US. Another method that digital public historians use is called network analysis. And this is used to explore connections between people's events or ideas. The 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon, this project, is a great example of this method in action, as it maps social networks in early modern Britain, visualizing the links between historical figures based on archival data. This kind of project not only makes historical data more accessible, but also encourages new interpretations of historical networks. Today, digital public history is a vibrant and complex field where projects are increasingly collaborative and multi-layered. One of the most impactful projects in recent years is the 1619 project by the New York Times Magazine, which uses multimedia elements to reframe the role of slavery in American history. I would highly encourage you to look at this project if you haven't seen it before. This is the one that has actually made history very political in the US in the last couple of years, because a lot of educators were using this to complicate the narratives of history, where, like, America was always exceptional and great, and talk more about slavery in America. And it's made history and history teaching in schools very highly politicized. So, but it's a really great project for everybody to take a look at. This project, by combining text, images, and interactive content, allowed users to engage with history on multiple levels, making it an accessible and deeply reflective experience. And of course, and as I mentioned, it sparked national conversations about history and memory, demonstrating digital public history's potential to shape public discourse. Other significant projects is the European Union-funded massive project called Europeana, which is a collaborative digital archive that makes millions of artifacts from European institutions freely available online. Europeana exemplifies the principles of digital public access, public history. It is open access, inclusive, and relies on the participation of cultural institutions across Europe. Europeana employs methods like metadata aggregation, user tagging, and digital exhibitions to create rich, multi-layered resources that invites users to explore European heritage in depth. There's a lot of Indian objects also, because a lot of these museums and archives contain, like, Indian artifacts. So if you are interested in that, I would say you want to spend some time browsing. It's a massive digital archive. In addition to these, historians also work with podcasting and videocasting, which has emerged as important digital public history formats in the last decade. At George Mason, where I work, we have a dedicated history podcasting studio called R2 Studios, where you can find a range of history podcasts made by historians for the public. I would suggest watch this space because there's a podcast that I'm making on Indian history that's coming on board in the next year. You will notice that almost all these projects I've just mentioned are Euro-American projects. This is not because digital public history projects don't exist outside the US or Europe, but it is very few and far between, and most of them are not done by academics within universities. So, for example, one of the most successful recent digital public history projects related to India is the Indian Memory Project, and that is not run out of an academic institution or run by historians. It was started by an individual receiving donations to keep the site running. One of the longest running South Asian digital public history projects is actually the 1947 Partition Archive that started out with some federal funding from the US in 2008 and involves academics, but now it is a collaborative project and a self-sustaining digital archive run through private donations. Other non-Western projects like Palestine Open Maps provide mapping visualizations to the public using historical maps from the 19th and 20th centuries. Again, they work with universities like Columbia Universities, but with significant donations from non-academic institutional entities. Then when academics are involved, what you see in the non-West is more like database related work where aggregation of historical information happens instead of historical information that is presented to the public. So for example, a big project that's done by Harvard University and it's ongoing is the China Biographical Database, which is a relational database with biographical information about 600,000 historical individuals from 7th through the 19th century in China. This database is really meant for further research and exploration, so it's not necessarily for the public. So as you can see from this rather brief analysis of digital public history projects, there is so much data that's already collected and available for in the Euro-American sphere for studying and producing Western history in the public realm. Because the data sets are already created. Now you can do interpretation and you can do a lot of work, public facing work. Whereas for India and China and a lot of these other sort of non-Western countries, we have the problem of actually gathering data. That is still not something that we do. So digital public history is inhibited by the lack of information or data that you can then use in digital projects. So for example, I'll show you this in my project. First, you have to collect data, historical data, make it digitally usable before you can actually get to the point of interpreting that data for the public. So it's like a multi-layered process that makes it more difficult. With the growth in the field comes several debates, many of which revolve around the theories and methods that I mentioned earlier. One significant debate about digital public history involves authority and community involvement. Traditionally, historians were the primary interpreters of history. Digital public history challenges this model by inviting communities and audiences to contribute to and even shape historical narratives. HistoryPin exemplifies this by inviting public contributions, but it also raises questions. How should historians balance expertise with community input? What does shared authority look like in practice, especially when dealing with contentious, sensitive topics? The accessibility and the digital divide is another pressing issue. Digital projects aim to broaden access to history, but not everyone has equal access to the internet or digital devices. Scholars like Sheila Brennan argue that without addressing the digital divide, digital public history risks reinforcing existing inequalities. We can already see this in action, the way AI has picked up the inequalities present in search engines like Google that predominantly includes histories produced in Western institutions and privileges histories of white Euro-American cultures. And if you're interested in this topic, I would highly recommend reading this book, Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble. Another debate involves sustainability and preservation. Many digital public history projects rely on temporary funding, making long-term maintenance challenging. The field is grappling with how to preserve digital projects for future generations. The rapid evolution of technology adds to this challenge as platforms and formats can become obsolete quickly. We need to do more about digital preservation practices, and those include looking at flexible and adaptive strategies to adapt to changing technology. Ethics and inclusivity are also critical areas of discussion in this field. Digital platforms allow public history projects to reach a global audience, but they also raise ethical questions about representation. Projects dealing with sensitive histories like the 1619 project navigate complex issues of identity and power. So how should digital public history handle diverse narratives and controversial topics? How can the field ensure inclusivity while maintaining historical accuracy? These questions are essential as digital public history moves forward, especially in projects involving marginalized communities. As you can see, the digital public history presents tremendous opportunities and for engaging with public with history. The use of social media, for instance, has allowed historical institutions and academics to communicate and connect with younger audiences in innovative ways. However, the challenges are real. Digital literacy remains an issue both for the public and for historians. Historians, by and large, lack the technical skills required to effectively design and maintain digital projects, while audiences need the digital literacy to navigate and interpret these resources. Scholars have argued that we must invest in training and resources to equip historians with the tools that they need to work effectively in digital spaces. So, keeping all that in mind, where are we headed? Looking forward, the future of digital public history likely lies in emerging technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, AI, machine learning, and those kinds of things. Imagine sort of VR being used for seeing a reconstruction of Pompeii before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. That project is already in progress. Or imagine using AR to be in the historic battlefield of Plassey with the Siraj Uddaulas and Robert Clive's soldiers and see that in reality that those kind of technologies are up and coming. The field is also moving towards more collaborative and community-driven models. Scholars are calling for projects that engage with communities, not only as audiences, but as co-creators of historical knowledge. This participatory model builds on the ideas of shared authority and seeks to empower communities to contribute actively to historical projects rather than passively consume them. My own project that you see on the screen, you can access it through the link provided, that's connectingthreads.co.uk. This project called Connecting Threads, Fashioning Madras in India and Caribbean takes some of these questions into consideration in doing history for the public first and then for the academics. Connecting Threads is a collaborative digital history project that looks at the contributions of Indian weavers, specifically South Indian weavers, and African Caribbean consumers to global history of dress and fashion. We work as a team of interdisciplinary researchers from the US and UK, and what we have done in this phase of the project is to re-examine the history of the Madras handkerchief, an internationally popular dress accessory made of brightly colored checked cotton. Our website includes a database in which we have collected over 300 references on the Madras handkerchief after looking through hundreds of historical records from the 18th and 19th centuries in 7 archives in 4 different countries. We also studied over 70 actual textiles at 6 different museums, including the V&A Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum, which is also one of our main project partners. All this research is interpreted on the website as a digital exhibition currently. We have essays and lesson plans as well for educators interested in using the database and exhibition to teach students in their classrooms. When my colleague Meha Priyadarshini, who's a historian at the University of Edinburgh, and I conceived this project, from the beginning, we were insistent that this is a born digital history project that produces original research and scholarship, but for a public audience. We were not going to write for academics, and we were going to produce first research that could be presented to the public. Both of us are originally from India, but we live in the West and work in Western academic institutions. So we wanted to make sure that the research reached outside of our institutions and the Western Academy and be available to a global public audience who might be interested in the history of these textiles. We just launched this project on October 11th at the Victoria and Albert Museum with an associated symposium. And you can, by the way, catch all the recordings of all the symposium talks on the website as well. And all the website and the symposium was designed with a public audience in mind, especially people of South India and the Caribbean, whose histories we were examining in this project. We wanted to explore the history of this lesser known textile because often this textile, the Madras handkerchief, is studied as a colonial trade good, and records when we come across them almost hide the contributions of the Indian weavers who made these textiles, and they say very little about the role of these textiles in clothing and fashioning identities of free and enslaved women of color in the Caribbean. It was mostly Black women who used these clothes as head wraps and neck kerchiefs, as you can see in the painting of these two dolls, especially the two dolls on either side. Excuse me. The exhibition uses the research that we have done over the last 2 years to explore the influence of Madras handkerchiefs on 18th and 19th century dress. The story that begins with the origins of Madras in South India goes to exploring Madras fashions in the Greater Caribbean, and then to the impact of those fashions in Europe and beyond. We are trying to bring to life why this fabric from India is actually so important culturally, not only in India, where we still see them as used as lungis, but also in the Caribbean, where they are part of national costumes and cultural performances in many different Caribbean countries even today. We are continuing to do more work on this project in the next year with a timeline map, which is going to provide a more immersive visualization into this data and make it easier for people to interact with the site. We also built this website to make it accessible in places where internet speeds are slow. The backend of this website is also set to include future collaborators who can contribute not just essays, but like cultural institutions can also use this as a space to hold related textiles and use our website as their website. So in that way, we are sharing our authority and using our platform to give space to other institutions, especially institutions in India and the Caribbean who may not have resources to set up a site. We did this with our symposium as well. We had both academics and non-academics there at the symposium, including a handloom weaver, Miss Ulagnathan from Chennai, and Regal, a designer from US Virgin Islands, who still uses this Madras fabric in her designs. So the idea of participatory history practice, sharing authority and working collaboratively with non-historians is an integral part of the way we have conceived this project. So now let's circle back to the broader question at hand. Why is this important? Why should we write or create history for a public? In some ways, William Dalrymple is right. Not that historians have created the space for WhatsApp history to flourish. I hope that the talk so far has proved that this is a reductionist understanding of the discipline of history and its practice. But underlying his criticism is the call to invite more publics to read history produced by historians. That we can, as academics, write deeply researched and nuanced histories, but we must also think about diverse channels to get these histories outside of academic institutions to a non-academic public. And that work should not just rest upon popular historians like Dalrymple or Manu Pillai, but people like me who work within universities and other academic institutions. It is not a matter of debate that most people now gain their information from search engines like Google. In less than a decade, the site for gaining information is set to pass from search engines like Google to social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, as well as to standalone AI platforms. The largest search engine in the world is going to be Meta, not Google, in the coming years. a 2023 research by Forbes found that 24% of people already use social media to search and get answers to questions. 46% of Gen Z already use social media as their search engine, not Google. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and TikTok are some of the leading sources of information that people have accessed. These changes are inevitable. And for now, historical discourse on these channels is dominated by non-historians. Often some of these entities produce problematic and incendiary renditions of history or unchecked, non-factual or counterfactual historical productions. This is especially true for India. So I took these screenshots from Instagram just before the talk started. And these were, when I search for India history in the search bar as my search terms, these are the ones that came up. And within that, at least two of them were tagged as, hashtag India history. And you can see that it's not historical at all. These are like imaginative renderings, one that looks almost like a watercolor painting. The other is definitely AI generated in some fashion. And this is the hashtag Indian history being used means that it is being presented to people who are interested in these histories. And there's no bifurcation between what is this history and what is, real history in these searches. The problem with this is also who are the people who are producing these kinds of histories. I found a couple of different things that, I wanted to highlight. There was this one group, their post on the left talks about the massacre of Mandyam Iyengars by Tipu Sultan. Now, the actual historical event is factual, but the way it's presented, if you can see from the language used that, it is incendiary and it is not objective. It's a biased positioning of like how they want people to see. I've highlighted this in the last portion after the tags. They ask the question, do you think it is time for Hindus to wake up and learn from the mistakes of the past, which is clearly propagandistic in nature. So if these kinds of histories are being presented as history, where they are not necessarily producing pseudo history, but taking a little event, a smaller event from out of context of the larger historical context, and then producing these kinds of posts. You can see something that's completely pseudo-historical, where they talk about a curse of the Gandhi family for not banning cow slaughter. And all these things are sort of jumbled up into this sort of search timeline. And that is hugely problematic. And this is the place that I would say historians need to reclaim. So how can we reclaim these spaces? Well, it requires more historians and students of history to train themselves in methods of digital public history. And I would say this does not require grant-funded projects like mine to get started. Anyone can have an Instagram account clearly and start posting historical research in an accessible language. So I think my call here is for everybody listening to actually seriously consider what it means to actually engage and not just consume content, but produce content that's historical, that's non-biased and objective, that takes existing sources and makes it available to people through social media channels and other ways. But for those of you who are actually interested in moving to the next stage of crafting historical projects for the public, I also want to introduce some easy and free options to get started on digital public history. And I will, again, share this presentation with the organizers so that you can have this information. So here are some of the free tools for you to get started. Obviously, you will need a computer and an internet connection, but otherwise, these tools are something that you can learn on your own. They are not difficult to learn at all. There are several tools developed by the Knight Lab in Northwestern University that is open access and provided here. There's timeline, story maps, Juxtapose.js, Soundside.js. They all do very different things and very interesting things. You can use them in class projects. You can just simply play around with them if you're interested. And I have provided a direct link to Knight Lab so that you can explore it through the presentation. There are a few mapping tools if you're interested in doing mapping projects such as OpenStreetMaps and MapWalker. If you want to integrate maps with storytelling, ArcGIS Story Map is a great option. I'm sorry I haven't listed it here. Some of that software, the platform is paid, but there is a free version as well. If you want to do historical text mining exercise, Voyant is a great little tool to play around with. You can also use the data tools from Hathi Trust to analyze historical data from their collections. They have a vast collection that is open access. If you want to do a little bit more complicated projects like network analysis, which is a fancy way of saying, I want to see how historical figures relate to one another, or historical places, events, and people relate to one another. And for this, you can, in a visual way, and you can, for this, use Palladio, which is a software made at Stanford University, or a tool called Gephi. If you just want to do digital exhibition or start a digital archive, you can use Omeka, which is a free content management system specifically designed for historical use that was actually developed at the center where I work at George Mason. It kind of works like WordPress. If you want to start a digital library, you can use the tool called Zotero. Twine is a free tool to make basic history games. So if you want to make like history app games, you can use Twine to play around with that. If you want to collect oral histories, and then there is Scalar, which is a little bit more advanced, and I'm happy to talk about that if you're interested in putting together a digital book publication online that can be cross-referenced, and which can also host other visualizations. If you want to collect oral histories from your neighborhood and make it available to the public, you can use Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, or OHMS, which is a free tool to collect, transcribe, and exhibit oral histories. And if you're interested in podcasting, there are tutorials online, and Audacity is a free audio editing software. You can host these podcasts for free on YouTube. If you want to do something like a photography archive of historical buildings, I would love to see someone do this for Kerala, where you can use something like Omeka as a content management system, and where you can also collaborate with other people who are interested in doing this work and put together a website for that. All these are, of course, free. What you need to do is invest your time. The point is, you can start small. History does not have to be capital H history. It does not have to be grand narratives. Histories can be local, place-based, and made for a smaller community. In fact, we need local histories, especially for regions like Kerala, that are understudied in many ways and that often does not get as much representations in these big historical studies. So to go back to the critique that Dalrymple made about historians ceding space by not writing history for the public, my answer to his critique is that it is not that simple. What makes this complicated is that history, especially in India today, is political. It is used as propaganda. To reclaim place for objective, researched history, we need more historians working on the small H histories. We need more people interested in not just producing academic books, but historians that take both primary archival research as well as secondary sources like existing academic books and translate them into social media posts, timeline visualizations, mapping projects, and so on. Winning the battle against historical disinformation online is an impossible task if it is left only to the handful of historians within academic institutions. There must be a concerted effort and increased interest in participatory history rooted in principles of accessibility and inclusivity, where academic historians work with those outside the field to produce more public-facing historical projects. Digital public history projects have shown how it can reshape histories in the ways in which we understand, interpret, and share the past. The transformative potential of the field is always there, but what we need is more hands on deck. And I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of any of these projects I've mentioned or the broader questions surrounding public history in India in the Q&A. Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
thank you very much. And I have a few problems regarding your interpretation of public history, which I'll come towards the end. I think I request the audience to answer query you regarding your own interpretation of digital public history and archives, please. Academic coordinator, can you read out the
There are no questions on the chat box, sir.
then I will have to, unless the director wants to intervene.
Thank you very much. Not explaining, but at the same time, I want to congratulate Deepthi Murali for a wonderful presentation. And I would like to ask one simple question. That's true regarding coining the word public history, especially in digital public history. What is this public in public history? Listening to your talk, what I felt is that public here stands as the provider of archival documents or persons who are able to read only non-academic literature or less complicated writings in history. Actually, public history, if that is the case, and which we read public and digital public history, I feel that there is some problem, and we need to rethink about the way in which it's not mere participation in providing archival documents or being able to read simple way in which history is depicted. Rather, the public in such digital history must be someone who could intervene the whole process of history making, and they should be able to negotiate it with the country situation in which they do, or something like that. Are there any possibility for such a public in the public history of document? It's one thing which I would like. Second is, when we say there is a public history which is less academic or without any academic organism, or and there are history which is purely academic. We are in a way trying to hierarchize knowledge itself. I feel that there is a kind of hierarchicization that's coming. Are there any other way to address such questions? And we need to hierarchically place or can we say something like different way in which history, I mean, knowledge has been presented? These are the two simple which I would like to.
Thank you, sir, for both questions. And I agree with you on both accounts. On the first question of shared authority, I kind of briefly mentioned that there is a public historian named Rebecca Wingo, W-I-N-G-O is her last name. She works with, in the US, she works with indigenous people who and their histories in very community-centered, community-focused ways. This is true also of one of my own colleagues in the history department, Gabi Tayak, last name is T-A-Y-A-C, and a lot of historians in the US who work on American history have started kind of working with communities whose histories they're writing. So of course, one of the needs of this is to move beyond traditional archives. So instead of just looking at what is in the national archives or in the state regional archives, they are actually including all sorts of histories, including things that were not considered histories even like 15, 20 years back, like shamanic practices, and considering how you can use people's histories and people's understanding of history and make that part. So that kind of goes to your second question about hierarchized ways of understanding history. So there is a negotiation that historians are beginning to do where they're trying to de-hierarchize and take in what are non-traditional historical sources and make, and in the case of India, I think the book by Sanjay Subramaniam and Narayan Rao, they had talked about this, like, the symbols of substance, like the archives, and thinking about archives as a colonial construct and how we should be going beyond that to look for historical records. And so that kind of thing has been translated into actually working with people. So when Rebecca writes about her work, her co-authors are usually people from the community, for example, so that she always produces co-authored works, even if it is in an academic publication or a digital public history publication, online website. Her co-authors are usually always, she never writes a single authored thing. It's always co-authored with indigenous people from the communities that she's working on. So yes, that kind of shared authority is, and it is true that towards your second question about the hierarchies, it is true that there is a hierarchy in place, and it is very apparent for me as someone who works in the field where even like traditional academics, even though public history has been a field in the US since the 70s, it is always seen as lesser than, like, most academics want to work as academic historians within university settings. And there is a hierarchy there, and we have to kind of work against that formulation. But when I was presenting it, I wanted to present it with the current ways of thinking about public history.
Yeah. Asha, if there anyone else?
No, sir.
There's something in Malayalam.
No, അദ്ദേഹം നമ്മുടെ അപ്ഡേറ്റ്സ് കിട്ടാനുള്ള, ഇറ്റ് വാസ് ജസ്റ്റ് ഫോർ ഗെറ്റിംഗ് അപ്ഡേറ്റ്സ് ഓൺ അവർ പ്രോഗ്രാം. There a question by Rachel.
Rachel has thanked her. Rachel has thanked you.
Okay, he has thanked. And one of the important aspects you raised is that of multivocality in interpretation. In her field, archaeology, one can see parallel lines of thought as archaeological projects are located on sites which have multiple meanings for multiple publics. She wants to reflect more on how one actually deals with multivocality, especially when one is dealing with contentious issues like some of the examples from India that Dr. Murali showed. Rachel is specifically concerned with academic history and archaeology being essentially interpretative in nature, and irrespective of the medium, it is difficult to present it in the kind of compelling and polemic way.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rachel. That's a very interesting question and a very complicated question. It is something that, I know that archaeologists have dealt with this for a long time, but it's also a concern for historians and art historians. I am trained as an art historian, so I'm going to speak from my point of view. One of the things that I have actually relied on when looking at like multiple layered histories of like, an object or a place is to kind of always start with what the object itself, or in your case, it would be the site itself. And one of the things that I've actually liked doing is to apply actor network theory to my work. So basically kind of think about all the sort of layers of, if you think about your site as the primary node of your research, of the question, that the historical question you're asking, then all these other layers of information appear as like these networks of that connect the site to multiple meanings and different kinds of interpretations, and to be transparent that these interpretations exist even when they may be biased or polemic. And I think we as historians need to contend, and some of them, even when they are pseudo-historical, I think it is I do personally think it's our job to make that this exists, that the pseudo history exists transparent, but at the same time critically analyzing that pseudo historical component to the interpretation of the site. I just wanted to provide that as an example. I work on Padmanabhapuram Palace architecture and the objects within Padmanabhapuram Palace. And essentially, like when you go there, you have these different interpretations of the site and what it is meant to do. I was told when I got there that the primary bedroom and the bed that was used was Martandavarma's bed. He was using that as a medicinal cot. And if you go to Padmanabhapuram Palace, that's like the information that they give you. But then why is this cot medicinal, or how is this cot medicinal? There's no archival sources or explanation given. So it is important to kind of think about where. So for me, I was looking at the actual construction of the bed, and I was able to find that the bed was using different kinds of woods that were non-uniformly placed, to understand that this bed's construction kind of differed from the other beds in the same palace complex that was on the higher levels of the palace. And so it is important to kind of look at whatever resources you have, and then consider, even if it's like, an urban myth or a legend that's coming. In my case, I want to give it consideration as I'm doing my historical research before I completely reject it. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, can I say something?
Yes.
Anyone else?
No, sir, not yet.
Not yet. I think one problem with your quote from Dalrymple in the beginning seems to be that, you see, he is accusing the academic historians of not reaching down up to people. But I think that is incorrect, to be my mind. Primarily because of the fact that, see, it is in 1935 that we have got something called an Indian History Congress, which actually developed from Indian national movement. And from then onwards, there has been direct contact between the historians of various kinds with the people, and they have reacted to history in various ways. That is one. Second thing, at least I can quote two public histories which are coming from outside the ranks of academic historians. One is, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru's Discovery of India, which nobody calls it history, but I think it can be called public history. Second is K.M. Ashraf's Life and Culture of the People of Hindustan. Now, K.M. Ashraf had a PhD, but never had an academic job, and finally ended up as doing clerical work in a party office. You see, and he wrote that book from there. So this kind of writing came up from not necessarily because of academics, but because something more powerful than that, which is the national movement. I think that is to be taken into account whenever there is a discussion of public history in India. One. Second point which I would like to raise is that, you see, the question of what is called local history, again public history. I have at least from our experience in Kerala, I think there has to be a slightly different position. I think it is not a question about historians reaching out to public alone. It is a question of also people actually imagining and making history. The other side. That has to be taken into account whenever we discuss public history seriously. because we have seen, at least from our own experience, I'm a person who actually is on the borderlines of academic history, having not done much of academic history, but have been in the public. There I have seen, actually people coming together, remembering things, imagining things, trying to recover their past. This is something which I have seen. It is not, they are not just audience, they are not just passive recipients. And this question of passive recipients came into being primarily because, as you said, the anti-democratic character of I'm not talking about the political dispositions. I'm talking about certain kind of history writing, which became mythified and which became, as you yourself pointed out, the Tipu Sultan Mandya and Yangar case, that kind of things, when it actually coming down to the digital plane, when actually it becomes part of what we called WhatsApp University or whatever, then what happens is that you have got a situation where you see the entire people who are receptive to such thing are fed by this kind of thing. And there is a question of categorical misinformation, which is treated as history, which is treated in public as history. That is not contested. That point I agree. When it is something that is misrecognition, misinformation, which is treated as history, and there the academics are unable to sort of point out that what exactly they are doing is actually not what this mythifications are doing. The question of myth and history becomes very important, and the delineation between myth and history, to draw the line clearly, is something that is very serious. That is something which one has to seriously discuss. And it is there that the whole debate on public history actually comes into being. That is what I believe. 1, 2. Third thing is, I think when you answered the question regarding Rachel, and I got a problem with Rachel also in the same way. So is that when it comes down to local history, this distinction between an archaeology, art historian, economic historian, cultural historian, and such things actually breaks down when you come down to local history. When you go to Padmanabhapuram Palace or somewhere else, or anywhere in India or anywhere in the world possibly, when it actually comes down to the looking at the local people, local population, whether they're indigenous or otherwise, you find that the delineations which we make as historians in the academic field, is that the public do not perceive in that fashion at all. Public may appear, they will like an art piece, but they will like also probably a motor vehicle in the same fashion, you see. So that is a problem there, See, when you have an art piece on one side and a motor vehicle on the other side, and they appreciating both these things in the same fashion, probably calling a motor vehicle as a piece of art. You see, you have got a problem there. You cannot, how do you sort of, understand such positions? All these things appear not from the point of an academic angle, from a historian's angle, from a university, but when you actually go down to the people and see how they perceive history, which may not be the same as an academic history. That is, I think the question of public history. That is what we have felt whenever we have tried. I am a person who tried to make local history in several places. And that is what I have felt whenever I go to them and talk to them regarding how they perceive the same event, which has been narrated umpteen number of times in historical writings. We find a very different kind of perception from them. That is where you see the question of public history. That is where public perception of history becomes important. I think that is my simple understanding regarding.
No, thank you, sir. I completely. So I should say that my entire talk. I talked about biases, but my own biases are coming from being trained in the Western academy, right? So these kind of divisions are coming in from this Western model of historical education that kind of breaks down in places when you're looking at local histories in Kerala, for example. And this is something that, I've had to contend with as I've done my research over and over again, where it doesn't sit quite firmly within these built disciplinary models in the US, for example. And so you're very right that, these kinds of things break down, first of all, the disciplinary boundaries break down, and does not make kind of any sense when you're on the ground doing actual history work. And it's also true about that thing where the question of who has the point about when you have to look at people making their histories as public perception of history versus that myth making when it takes on its own form and becomes these sort of pseudo histories. Like, where is that balance? And here's where I think the question about shared authority has is being asked currently in at least in the US, where how do you mitigate this constant friction between wanting to give space for non-academics, or wanting to give space for people and people's understanding of history and memory making attached to history practices, versus what is then pseudo history, and how do you then stop the propagation of pseudo history? And so even in that, I think the question that the director sir asked earlier about hierarchies, even in this instance, I think what we are not really saying outright is, even when we think about adding people's histories, local histories, making people's part of the shared culture of, or shared authority of writing histories, the historian is still being the authority figure there. Who gets to decide history is simply within the bounds of the historian, not within the bounds of the public, is sort of where we are still on that question. And in many ways, I think it should be that way, considering the propagation of all the pseudo historical channels out there. But I think in that you're absolutely right that the disciplinary models that is built upon Western understandings of history stop functioning at some point when you look at histories of the non-West.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There's a hand up.
Gautam, you can ask the question.
Thanks, Deepthi, for this very interesting presentation. I don't even know if what I'm going to say is a question or a comment, and I just there are some thoughts that are whirling around, but I wanted to sort of take up, at least in the form in which he asked it, what Dineshan had asked when he asked about who or what is the public. But I was interested in the other two terms as well in digital public history. One is, why is it that, I mean, of course, you work in the history department, we are the Council for Historical Research, etc. So therefore, why history? But there should be there is obviously a deeper reason why we should why history is there's some sort of crisis of history rather than the, let's say, other disciplines of knowledge. Why is it that history is at stake? And I suspect that something that Professor Ganesh said might be relevant, which is this I can't think of a better word now, but the sort of co-natality of nation and history. And in a sense, the crisis of the nation also becomes a crisis of history. So that was one I wanted to hear what you had to say about that. The other was, of course, digital. Is this, in a sense, are we trying to make a left liberal version of WhatsApp history, or or it can be the other way around also. The WhatsApp history is the right-wing version of, or should we simply assume digital as the part of the situation, the part that's not going to go away, part of the situation that we are in, or is there something conceptually relevant about digital in when you say digital public history? That's all.
Thank you, Gautam, for the questions. So I will answer the second question first, because I think that's the easier question to answer. It's not an easy question, but it's the easier of the two. Well, no, I mean, you can use the WhatsApp historians. Historians are part of the digital public history. It is already exists. It will continue to exist and propagate. And the question is whether historians want to sit back and let that happen, or do we want to intervene in some ways? And if we were to intervene, I would say that we need to enter into the world of digital media in different ways, and and I would say that that's through doing this small H history, whether it is on WhatsApp or Instagram, or making podcasts or writing op-eds. It doesn't matter which tool you use to actually do it, but it's not about it can be, the digital medium itself is apolitical. It's what we make of it. And I think the idea is, whether it's right or left-leaning, we need more historically minded individuals with the training to understand history, to get into these arenas, the digital sphere. And in the absence of which, I think we will continue to see this kind of promulgation of WhatsApp histories, which, I mean, if they are right-leaning histories, I would still understand, but I think it is the right-leaning pseudo-histories that I have a problem with. The other question about the crisis of history, yes, I see this. I mean, you can see this in India with a lot of the sort of pseudo-histories that is attached to ideas of the nation state. You see that in the US as well. It is, we are having increasing pressure on institutions, especially school history education here in the US, where it's happening in India, but like here, they have really started pushing back on those. I don't know if this conversation was around, was available globally, but like there was a huge pushback against what the right called the critical race theory, and how that should not appear in classes. There has been a huge pushback against teaching history of that talked about slavery in the US, about the oppression of indigenous people in the US. It's been a huge problem in the last 5 years, to the point that the center where I work, we are actually creating materials now for high school teachers to use in classrooms, because they are finding it increasingly difficult to get those materials through official school channels in a lot of the especially conservative states in the US. So it's a problem. The crisis of history is very real, and what you're getting taught in schools, I think that's where that battle becomes really adamant. So that is definitely a problem. We have in my own work, this has become this is a continuing issue. I also manage another project for the Smithsonian that was mentioned in the introduction, which is about looking at Black archives and museums within historically Black colleges and universities, which are these really old, hundreds of years old universities that were meant for just educating Black people during the time when it was segregated. And they continue to be these institutions where people go to study. And they have wonderful collections of archives and museums that have been digitized. And we've been working with the Smithsonian in digitizing and preserving those collections. And that was funded through the federal government's National Endowment for the Humanities. And now we are wondering if we'll have a second round of that project because of who just got elected here in the US. So there is a direct impact. The crisis has direct impacts, I think, everywhere on historical projects, from the ideas of nation state and nationalism in different ways, I think. I'm sorry, that was a very round, I don't know if I got your question, but like that was my very roundabout way of answering that question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sir, shall we wind up the program?
There is no one else, I think. Yeah, we can
Yes.
wind up. I'll just make one comment. It's not necessarily a question or anything, but I think, to me at least, she has opened up a possibility, but at the same time opened up a lot of issues which cannot be fully settled in a seminar like a webinar like this. The opening up of the possibility is that, you know, I'm not particularly happy with the word, frankly speaking, digital histories. In fact, I was talking to Dineshan about it. I am happy with the word history, but it can be converted into a form, which is quite possible, which is okay. So that way one can talk about digital histories. But when we talk about digital histories as a specific mode, I think we will get into problems of this kind, which you already outlined very well. Because that is where the whole debate comes in. When, for example, unlike the earlier period, when, for example, your own knowledge forms are enclavized and kept within yourself in various ways, this digital form actually takes you out of that and brings your knowledge form to all the sections of the people. And also there is a possibility of advertising it and telling the others that this is the real knowledge, this is the correct knowledge. So there is a question of correctness regarding what exactly is knowledge. So that is one issue, and that is where the whole thing about what Dalrymple's original quotation comes in, because that is where I think the academic historians will have to shed their academic, hierarchies, and come down to the people and tell them what exactly they think as the correct form of history. That is one. Second thing is, what you have projected from the digital platform is a large number of other possibilities, which in KCHR we are now beginning to explore, which is that of mapping and, connectivity and mapping and correlations and all kinds of other things there are possibilities of bringing out things that have not been visible earlier. So that is, I think, a very interesting process. Possibly a kind of history that has not been visualized earlier, real people's history now, is possible for using the digital platform. That is another possibility. That is, I think, is very welcome, and we are trying to pursue it from our own ways. That is the second thing. Third thing is, I am just commenting upon one thing regarding nation, and very interesting thing raised by Gautam, and you yourself responded to in one way. I am trying to respond it not from a US point of view, but from an Indian nationalist. I'm not a nationalist per se, but I'm talking about as an Indian nation. The possibility regarding an Indian nation is the question of multivocality, which Rachel was talking about. Unlike US, you have got multicultural kind of situations there. We have got a situation of multivocality, along with not only multicultural, multi-ethnic and multi-lingual compositions, which creates a large number of disparities as well as confluences in the historical process itself. That is something which we are not yet mapped. I mean, seriously. What the type of histories that we have been pursuing in India, I'm sure that majority of places also, has been that of the history of the elite.
Yeah.
History of the upper class, history of the elite. That is where history has come in so far. Now, when you come down to the position of your breakup of history at the local level, that you find that this multicultural, multi-ethnic and multilingual kind of groups that have been there for a long time, a longer period than US. I mean, I'm not talking about the American subcontinent, American continent. I'm talking about something called a nation. I don't know whether it is a nation even now. But anyway, United States of America. so that, there is a difference there. That is where the challenge of the historian becomes much more serious. Because you have to map across times, you have to map across spaces, you have to map across cultures. And therefore, this creates a substantial amount of problem. And the problem is tried to be resolved through myth making. That is where I think the importance of myth making comes in, because national myths, regional myths, cultural myths, all kinds of myths are created in order to overcome this problem in their own fashion, in one's own fashion. So that, I think, is a serious issue which we have to discuss when we discuss history going to the public. And I'm sure that the historians as well as those people who are interested in history will take up this issue. I think you have opened up a very interesting point of discussion and debate. I think, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, sir, for that. Like, yeah, I agree that doing work on India makes things complicated in much different ways, and sometimes as you said, in much more complex ways than it does in the US. And the problem also is that because it is so complex and vast, I think we don't have enough people working on these histories, and that is and yes, you rightly pointed out, a lot of people who work on these histories work on like the sort of kings, empires, elite histories, and that has also caused that that kind of dichotomy in what is available versus what needs to be done. So yes, thank you for that feedback. If are there any other questions or?
Yeah. We can wind up, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ken Ganesh, for chairing the session. Thank you, Professor Dinesh Vadakil, for providing all kinds of support for the official performance. Thank you, Dr. Deepthi Murali, for being part of our webinar. Thank you for the participants for actively taking part in the program. And finally, thank you for the entire KCHR team, especially Gautam Das, our project assistant for academics, Sandhya Essen, our publication assistant, Hida, our computer operator, and Jishnu, our graphic designer, for supporting me during the entire coordination of the event. There is an announcement regarding our next webinar. It is scheduled to be held on 20th November, that is Wednesday at 3:30, by Dr. Divya Kannan, Assistant Professor, Department of History and Archaeology, Shiv Nadar University, on the topic Contested Childhoods, Caste and Education in Colonial Kerala. All are invited. Thank you.
Thank you.